Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into something a little bit different today?
Always up for a challenge.
Me too. Okay, so today we're tackling organizational change.
Ooh, that's a big one. Always relevant though, right?
Absolutely. It's something we all deal with at some point, whether we like it or not. So we're taking a deep dive into a LinkedIn article called The Power of Fairness in Organizational Change, Lessons from Scarf and Fair Process. It's by Miguel Nogueral.
Sounds intriguing.
Right. And our mission today is to figure out why fairness is so crucial when things at work get shaken up.
Makes sense. I mean, we all know change can be tough, especially in the workplace.
Exactly. I mean, some people seem to handle it better than others.
That's true. You've got those who are like, bring it on. What's next?
Yeah, the change enthusiasts, right?
Right. And then you've got others who, well, let's just say they're a little more resistant.
Yes. The change-averse. We've all met them.
Definitely. I think it really all comes down to how our brains perceive change. You know, change disrupts our routines, and our brains, they love routines.
They crave that predictability.
Exactly. So when that routine gets disrupted, our brain kind of goes, hold on, potential threat detected, almost like a warning signal.
It's like our brains are stuck in fight or flight mode,
Yeah,
even if the change is actually a positive one.
exactly. So the question is, how do we get past that initial freak out response?
Right. Because it can be so hard to see the potential benefits when you're stuck in that fear mode.
Totally. And this is where I think the SCARF model can be really helpful.
Okay, tell me more about this scarf model.
So it was developed by Dr. David Rock, and it basically identifies 5 key social domains that heavily influence our behavior. And they actually form the acronym SCAR-F.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What are these 5 domains?
Right, so we've got status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and of course, fairness.
Status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Got it.
And what's really interesting is that each of these domains can trigger either a reward response in our brains, like, hey, this is good, or a threat response.
Right, like danger, Will Robinson.
Exactly.
So it's like our internal reward system is constantly evaluating whether a change is going to be a win or a loss for us, socially speaking.
Precisely. And these responses are incredibly powerful, like way more powerful than we might realize.
Oh, I believe it.
Research has actually shown that a perceived threat to one of these social domains can trigger a reaction in the brain that's as intense as physical pain.
Whoa. Seriously. So being passed over for a promotion or feeling left out of a decision, that could actually register in the brain the same way as like stubbing your toe.
Yeah, kind of wild, right?
That is wild. So being constantly bombarded with those feelings of unfairness at work, that's basically creating this constant sense of pain in our brains.
It's definitely not helping.
No wonder change can be so stressful.
Exactly. And of course, that pain can then lead to resistance, resentment, and a whole host of other negative reactions.
Yeah.
If you feel like you're being treated unfairly, you're way less likely to embrace any change, no matter how good it's supposed to be for you.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's like if you already feel like the system is rigged against you, why would you trust that any change is going to be for the better?
Exactly. So the big question is, how do we create an environment where change feels less like a threat and more like something we can handle, maybe even get excited about?
Right. How do we shift from that freight or flight mode to something a little more, well, optimistic?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mhm.
And this is where, alongside the SCARF model, I think there's another framework that can be really helpful. And it's called the Fair Process Framework.
Mm.
It was developed by W. Chan Kim and Renee Moborn, the authors of Blue Ocean Strategy.
Okay, fair process. I'm listening. How does this help us manage change more effectively?
So it's all about creating a sense of fairness and transparency throughout the decision-making process. And it emphasizes that it's not just about the end result, it's about how you get there.
Right, the journey matters.
Exactly. The journey matters as much as the destination. And this fair process is built on 3 key principles:
All right, lay it on me. What are these principles?
engagement, explanation, and expectation clarity.
Engagement, explanation, and expectation clarity. Okay, let's break those down. What does engagement look like in a practical sense?
So engagement means involving people in the decision-making process right from the start.
Okay, so not just dropping a bomb on everyone at the last minute.
Exactly. It's about gathering input, actively soliciting feedback, encouraging open dialogue about the proposed changes.
So it's about creating a more collaborative environment rather than just dictating change from the top down.
Exactly. And it's about making people feel like their voices are heard,
Right.
that they're genuinely part of the process.
Right. Not just pawns in someone else's game.
Right, exactly. And, I think a lot of leaders worry that if they open it up for too much discussion, it's going to get messy.
Right. Or that they'll be opening Pandora's box. What if they can't implement every suggestion that comes up?
Right. And you're absolutely right. You're not going to be able to incorporate every single idea.
Mm.
But the key is to be transparent about why certain decisions were made. And that brings us to the second principle, explanation.
Okay. Explanation. Let's unpack that one.
All right. So explanation is all about being transparent about the reasons behind the change.
Okay.
So it's about clearly articulating the why.
Right. Not just because I said so.
Exactly. Why is this change necessary? What factors were considered? What are the potential benefits? What are the potential drawbacks? The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Honesty and transparency.
Exactly. And what we find is that when people understand the why, they're much more likely to buy in, even if they don't completely agree with every aspect of the decision.
It's like you're pulling back the curtain and showing people the inner workings of the decision-making process. Instead of just being told what to do, they understand the logic behind it.
Exactly. And that really builds trust.
Right. And it helps reduce that feeling of being powerless.
Exactly. And so then that brings us to the third principle, expectation clarity.
Okay. No more vague pronouncements about exciting new directions without any concrete details. Is that what you're saying?
No more of that. We're done with the vague stuff.
Okay, good.
We need clarity. Expectation clarity is all about setting crystal clear expectations for what will happen after the change is implemented. What are the new roles and responsibilities? What are the new performance metrics? How will success be measured? All the nitty-gritty details.
Right. So it's like having a roadmap instead of wandering around in the dark.
Yes, exactly. And what happens is the clearer those expectations are, the less uncertainty people feel, the less anxiety they feel.
Right, because it's that fear of the unknown that really amps up the stress.
Exactly.
So, okay, we've got SCAR-F, which helps us understand how our brains react to change. And then we've got FAIR process, which provides this framework for actually implementing change in a way that minimizes those negative threat responses.
Exactly. And you know what I think is so cool? It's how beautifully these two frameworks work together.
Ah, I was hoping you'd say that. Tell me more. How do they complement each other?
So when you apply the principles of FAIR process, you're actually directly addressing those key social domains in the SCARF model. Do you see what I mean?
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the connections here. Give me an example. Like, how does this actually play out in real life?
Okay, so let's take status, for example.
Okay.
When you engage people in the decision-making process, you're acknowledging their expertise, you're valuing their perspectives.
Right.
And that directly boosts their sense of status within the organization.
So instead of feeling like their opinions are being ignored, they feel like valued contributors.
Exactly. And it's the same with certainty. When you provide clear explanations about the reasons for the change, you're increasing their sense of certainty.
Right, because knowing what's happening and why it's happening helps reduce that anxiety and fear of the unknown.
Exactly.
It's that feeling of, okay, I may not love this change, but at least I understand why it's happening.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Okay, and now think about relatedness.
Mhm.
Collaboration and open communication during the change process that enhances relatedness, right?
Okay, yeah, because it creates this sense of teamwork, a sense of shared purpose.
Exactly. People feel more connected to their colleagues and to the organization as a whole.
Right, like they're all in it together.
Exactly. And then finally, you've got autonomy. By giving employees a chance to contribute their ideas, to have some influence on the process, you're supporting their sense of autonomy.
So even in the midst of all this change, they still have some control over their own destiny. It's not just something being imposed upon them from on high.
You got it. And so all of this, the engagement, the explanation, the expectation, clarity, it all contributes to a greater sense of fairness. And as we've discussed, fairness is absolutely crucial for getting people on board with change and minimizing those negative reactions.
Okay, so we've got these two great models, SOHAR-F and FAIR process. But how do they actually play out in the real world? Like, can you give me a concrete example of how this all comes together?
Absolutely. So in the article, the Gelk, he shares a really compelling case study from his own work as an executive coach.
Okay, I'm all ears.
He was working with a divisional GM at a global manufacturing company.
Okay.
And this GM, he needed to restructure his entire division.
Ooh, that's a big deal.
Huge undertaking. And you can imagine the initial reaction from employees was, Well, not exactly positive.
I can only imagine a major restructure. That's going to trigger all sorts of those threat responses we've been talking about. People fearing for their jobs, their status, their whole career trajectory.
Exactly. But instead of just bulldozing ahead, this GM, he decided to try something different. He decided to implement these fair process principles to help smooth the transition.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. What did he actually do?
So he started by creating a space for open dialogue.
Okay.
He organized these listening sessions, focus groups, where employees could voice their concerns, ask questions, offer suggestions. And even though not every idea could be implemented, just the simple act of listening, it made a huge difference.
Yeah. It seems so basic, but I bet that made people feel like they were actually being heard and respected.
It totally did. It completely shifted the dynamic.
So he listened. What else did he do?
Then he held town hall meetings where he explained the rationale behind the restructuring. But he did it in a really clear and concise way.
Okay.
He painted a picture of the potential benefits, not just for the company, but for the employees too.
Right. So he wasn't just like dictating what was going to happen. He was explaining the why behind it.
Exactly. He
Wow.
didn't sugarcoat things.
Right.
He was honest and upfront about the challenges and the opportunities.
So real talk.
Real talk.
I like it.
And then to further reinforce that sense of clarity, he provided really detailed information about the new roles, the responsibilities, their performance metrics. So no one was left wondering, what's expected of me? Or how can I succeed in this new structure?
Right. No ambiguity. So I have to ask, did this approach actually work? Like, did prioritizing fairness make tangible difference in the outcome?
It totally did.
Really?
There was definitely some initial resistance,
Mm-hmm.
but the fair process, it really helped to create this sense of psychological safety.
Okay.
So people felt more comfortable sharing their thoughts and ideas.
Okay.
They were more willing to embrace the changes.
And so what happened?
Then the restructuring, it was completed ahead of schedule, and the division ended up exceeding its performance targets.
Wow. So not only did this approach make the process less painful for everyone involved, it actually led to better outcomes.
It did, which I think is a pretty compelling argument for taking the time to do things the right way.
Right. It's like sometimes the slower, more thoughtful approach actually gets you where you need to go faster in the long run.
Exactly. But, there's another side to this story.
Uh-oh. I have a feeling this is where things get a little bit, well, less rosy.
You might be right about that. What happens when organizations ignore the principles of fairness during change? What are the consequences of just charging ahead without considering the human impact? That's what we'll be talking about next.
All right, so we've seen how prioritizing fairness during organizational change can lead to, well, smoother transitions, better outcomes, all that good stuff. But what happens when organizations just like toss fairness out the window?
Yeah, it's not pretty. Remember Kim and Malborn, the authors of A Blue Ocean Strategy?
The fair process, folks.
Exactly. They've done a lot of research on what happens when organizations prioritize, like speed or efficiency over fairness.
What did they find?
Let's just say the results are not encouraging.
Okay, I'm ready for a cautionary tale. Hit me with an example. What happens when fairness gets ignored?
Okay, so one of their case studies involved a manufacturing company that decided to implement a brand new operational model.
Okay, sounds promising. What went wrong?
On the surface, it probably seemed like a good idea.
Right. Streamlining processes, boosting efficiency, all those buzzwords we love to hear.
Right, exactly. But there was one major problem.
I think I can guess. They forgot to involve the people who would actually be affected by this change.
Bingo. They basically sprung this new model on everyone. No consultation, no explanation, no training.
Ouch. Yeah, that's going to leave a mark. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
It was. Employees were completely blindsided.
Right. They had no idea why these changes were happening, how it was going to impact their jobs, or even what was expected of them.
It created this massive sense of uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah, it's like instead of getting everyone excited about this new, efficient model, they ended up with a workforce that was confused, anxious, and probably pretty resentful.
Exactly. The lack of transparency, the lack of engagement, it just created this breeding ground for negativity, speculation, and plummeting morale.
And did this actually affect their performance?
You bet it did. Productivity tanks.
So they were aiming for efficiency, but they ended up shooting themselves in the foot.
Big time.
Wow. Okay, so this is a pretty extreme example, but I think most of us have experienced, smaller everyday instances of unfairness at work. Maybe it's a decision that felt kind of arbitrary or a lack of transparency about how decisions are being made. Those little things that kind of chip away at your trust over time.
Exactly. Death by a thousand cuts.
Right. So how do we as individuals, how do we start to recognize those moments when things are unfair?
That's the key question, isn't it?
Right. And then how do we speak up about it in a way that's constructive, that doesn't just make us sound like a complainer?
So I think the first step is just awareness.
Okay, so becoming more aware of those moments when fairness is being overlooked.
Exactly. We've talked about the principles of fair process, engagement, explanation, expectation, clarity.
Right. Yeah.
When you see those principles being ignored or violated, that should be a red flag.
Okay, so it's about noticing when decisions are being made without any input from the people who are going to be affected, or when there's just this lack of communication about the why behind things.
Yeah. Or when expectations are just like constantly shifting.
Yeah.
No one knows what's going on.
Right, that feeling of just being in the dark.
Exactly. And once you've kind of identified those red flags, the next step is to find a way to voice your concerns.
Okay, but that's the hard part, right? It's easy to feel like you're rocking the boat or being difficult if you speak up.
Yeah.
So how do we approach those conversations in a way that's, assertive but also respectful?
It is tricky. And I think, honestly, it depends a lot on the situation and your relationship with the person you're talking to. But one thing that I think is always helpful is to approach it from a place of genuine curiosity and a desire to understand.
So instead of like accusing or blaming, it's more like, hey, I'm a bit confused about how this decision was made. Can you help me understand the thinking behind it?
Exactly. Just open it up as a conversation.
Right. And honestly, I think most people, even those in leadership positions, they genuinely want to create a fair and equitable environment.
Right. They just might not always realize that their actions are being perceived as unfair.
So sometimes just by speaking up in a constructive way, you can help them see things from a different perspective and maybe even course correct.
Yeah.
It's about having the courage to be a voice for fairness, not just for yourself, but for others too.
I love that. A voice for fairness.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about how organizations can implement these fair processes, but what about us, the listeners out there?
Yeah, what about them?
Why should we care about all of this, especially if we're not in a position to make those big organizational decisions?
That's a great question. And here's the thing. Even if you're not the CEO or a senior leader, just understanding these principles, it can be incredibly valuable in your own career and even in your personal life, too.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more. How can we apply these ideas to our own lives?
Well, first of all, I think it can really help you navigate any kind of change more effectively.
Okay.
Whether it's a new boss, a new team structure, a new project, even just dealing with those everyday transitions.
So it's like we can start to recognize those scarf elements at play in our own lives.
Exactly.
And see how fairness, or the lack of fairness, might be influencing our reactions to things.
Exactly. Let me give you an example. Let's say your company's implementing a new software system.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
Think about how that change might impact those 5 social domains of SCARF.
Okay, let's see. Status, maybe some people are worried that their expertise with the old system is no longer going to be valued.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Certainty, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty about how this new system is going to work, what it means for their day-to-day tasks. Autonomy, people might feel like they've lost some control over their workflow. Relatedness, the transition could create these divisions between the people who adapt quickly and those who struggle.
Definitely.
And of course, fairness, if the training and support for the new system are inadequate, people are going to feel like they're being treated unfairly.
You nailed it. By just recognizing those potential triggers, you can start to proactively manage your own emotional responses to change.
So it's about being more self-aware, but it's also about empowering ourselves to speak up when things don't feel quite right.
Yes, exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll even inspire those around you to start prioritizing fairness as well.
Yeah.
It's contagious.
I like that, paying it forward. Okay, so we've covered the good, the bad, and the ugly of ignoring fairness. But I want to shift gears for a minute and bring it back to the individual level.
Okay.
We've talked about how organizations can implement these fair processes, but for our listeners out there, what about those situations where, decisions just can't be made fairly.
Yeah, that's the real world, right?
Right. Life isn't always fair.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that? How do we manage our own emotional responses when we're faced with situations that feel unfair, even if there's like a legitimate reason for it?
That is the million-dollar question, and that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive today.
So we've talked about how organizations can try to make things fairer, but as you said, life isn't always fair.
It's not. Sometimes you just get a bad deal.
Exactly. And it can be so frustrating. Like, how do we deal with those situations where no matter how hard we try, it just feels like things are stacked against us?
That's the tough part.
It is. Because we can't always control the circumstances, but we can hopefully control our reactions.
There you go. That's the key.
Okay, I like that. But how do we actually do that? Like, how do we prevent those feelings of unfairness from, like, taking over and turning into negativity and resentment?
Well, I think the first step is to recognize that those feelings are totally normal.
Okay, so it's not about suppressing those emotions.
No, it's about acknowledging them like, hey, I'm feeling frustrated right now. This doesn't seem fair.
Right.
Because when we try to push those feelings down, they tend to just fester and grow stronger.
Makes sense.
But it's also about not letting those emotions control us.
So it's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between acknowledging the validity of those feelings, but also choosing how we want to respond.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that, yeah, this situation might suck, but I still have a choice in how I react to it.
So instead of dwelling on the unfairness of the situation, maybe we can shift our focus to things we can control, you know?
Yeah,
Like our own actions, our own attitudes.
precisely. It's about, like, taking back our power, even in situations that feel powerless.
Right. It's about choosing to focus on solutions rather than getting stuck in this like cycle of negativity.
I love that.
I think that's such a powerful message because it's easy to get caught up in the blame game
Right.
or to feel like we're victims of circumstance.
Oh, yeah.
But ultimately, like you said, we always have a choice in how we respond.
And sometimes that choice might be to simply accept the situation for what it is and move on.
That's a really good point because not every battle needs to be fought.
Exactly. Sometimes the most empowering thing we can do is just let go.
And focus our energy on things we can actually change.
Yes, 100%. And that
Yeah.
might involve, setting boundaries, communicating our needs more assertively, maybe seeking support from others.
It's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Yes, love it.
And remember, even in the face of unfairness, there are always opportunities for growth and learning.
That's so true.
Maybe this experience has taught you something valuable about yourself or about how to navigate those challenging situations in the future.
It's all about perspective.
Reframing that experience, right, as an opportunity rather than just a setback.
Exactly. It's about finding that silver lining, even in the midst of a storm.
Well, on that note, I think this has been such a fantastic deep dive into the power of fairness, especially during times of change.
I agree.
We explored how organizations can try to create fairer processes.
We did.
And, more importantly, we talked about how we as individuals can try to manage our own emotional responses when we're inevitably faced with those situations that just don't feel fair.
It all starts with us, right?
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today.
It was a pleasure being here.
And to all of you listening, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another fascinating deep dive into ideas that matter.